Hey everybody, you're listening to Creep It Real. My name is Ashley.
And I'm Bianca.
I almost forgot what we were doing, but here we are. Thanks for joining us, everybody, at Creep It Real.
Welcome back, and thank you guys so much for the feedback on our Alex Jones episode. All the feedback.
Yeah, even all the haters.
Yes. The algorithms on all the sites actually boost us if you interact, even if you're a hater and a half. So, thank you.
And honestly, it's just fun to hear your little
rantings and ravings.
Quarrels that you have, or the issues that you have with me. It's fun, you know. I've always loved to argue, and so now I can just do it in my head. It's fun.
The sources for today's episode include, I think, a ton of internet research just from independent news networks, and we're going to just include those in the show notes. Ashley, do you have other... Okay, nope. Sounds good. Let's get into it.
Yeah, no BSing this week, I guess.
Yeah,
it's okay. No. Straight to the point. So we went into this episode with the idea that we were going to be covering the deaths of several prominent civil rights leaders from the Ferguson protests, and that's pretty much, you know, a cursory glance at what happened in Ferguson to begin with. But once we got into researching it, it took on a whole other angle that frankly made me pretty uncomfortable, and it challenged the beliefs that I had previously held, which is good. And also, when you're making a podcast, coming into it with one idea and then you're just like, wait a second, it's kind of disturbing. It's happened to us before.
Yeah, it's happened to me before doing the show with you, where I'm like, it happened with Casey Anthony. It happened with you on your first show with John Bonet.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. We covered America's Unfinished Revolution in June, where we discussed the abolition of slavery, which just kind of continued under another name for decades, and the civil rights movement that was birthed to fight for racial equity. And today, like I said, we started out with the intent of covering suspicious deaths of Ferguson civil rights leaders, and instead what organically kind of happened was the next step in the civil rights coverage. What really happened in Ferguson, Missouri, that sparked national recognition of the Black Lives Matter movement, and what many view as the beginning of a new civil rights movement, because it's not quite what I thought it was, according to the facts. If you've been paying attention to the history of civil rights, many times its leaders are seen as so threatening that they are either overtly or covertly removed. You can see that these as coincidences, the very same coincidences taking place during the civil rights movement, or you can acknowledge that we have kind of a serious problem where outspoken civil rights activists are being silenced by their opposition. We know by now that lynching, however antiquated the term may seem to some, is still very prevalent to this day. Humans are hanged, they are dragged, their necks are knelt on for 9 minutes.
I was really surprised this summer because after the George Floyd protests, I found out that Riverside, which is the county that I lived in when I lived in Temecula, the people were literally lynching people.
Yeah.
And I don't know, this has been like the culmination of a lot of anxiety and stress and depression that has weighed on me since then. And I was surprised because this happened in California. Yeah. It didn't happen in a state that is, I guess, more known to be racist. Not that the state just inherently is racist, but California is known to be a state that is very liberal and very open-minded. And it happened in Riverside County, and it's been crazy. Anyways,
yeah,
we're talking about a completely different civil rights movement today, so it was weird to me. Anyways, the Ferguson unrest, sometimes called the Ferguson uprising, the Ferguson protests, or Ferguson riots, in Ferguson, Missouri, involved protests beginning on August 10th of 2014, which was the day after the fatal shooting of Michael Brown by police officer Darren Wilson. The unrest sparked a substantial debate in the United States about the relationship between law enforcement officers and the Black community, the militarization of police, and the use of force law in Missouri and nationwide. Continued activism expanded the issues to include modern-day debtors' prisons for-profit policing and school segregation. As the details of the original shooting emerged, police established curfews and deployed riot squads to maintain order. Along with peaceful protests, there was significant looting and violent unrest in the vicinity of the original shooting as well as across the city. There was also significant media criticism of the militarization of the police when dealing with violent protests in Ferguson. The unrest continued on November 24th, 2014, after a grand jury did not indict Officer Wilson. It briefly continued again on the 1-year anniversary of Michael Brown's shooting. The Department of Justice concluded Wilson shot Brown in self-defense.
What really happened the day of Michael Brown's death? At approximately noon on Saturday, August 9th, 2014, Officer Darren Wilson of the Ferguson Police Department shot and killed Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old man. There was no video taken of the interaction between Brown and Wilson. The most circulated story was that Brown was attempting to surrender and had his hands up when Wilson shot him. When protesters say, "hands up, don't shoot," they are referring to Michael Brown. The day of the shooting, St. Louis County police detectives conducted an initial canvass of the area. FBI agents then independently canvassed more than 300 residences to locate and interview additional witnesses. Then the criminal section of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Missouri, and the FBI collectively known as the Department opened a criminal investigation into whether the shooting violated federal law. They reviewed physical, ballistic, forensic, and crime scene evidence, medical and autopsy reports, which included an independent autopsy performed by the U.S. Department of Defense Armed Forces Medical Examiner Service, Wilson's personnel records, audio and video recordings, and internet postings. FBI agents, St. Louis County police detectives, federal prosecutors, and prosecutors from the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office independently and jointly interviewed more than 100 purported eyewitnesses and other individuals claiming to have relevant information. They found that Wilson was on duty driving his department-issued Tahoe when he saw Michael Brown and his friend walking eastbound in the middle of the street. The two had just come from Ferguson Market, a convenience store nearby, where at approximately 11:53 it was reported that Brown stole several packages of blunts, essentially. A surveillance video from the store shows the store clerk attempting to stop Brown, and Brown shoves him away. The clerk then called the police, giving a description of Brown and his friend, and a dispatch went out over the radio establishing that Wilson was aware of the, quote, stealing in progress. God damn it. Tribute to Sean Connery. Stealing in progress and description of the two young men. Wilson then called for backup and backed his SUV, blocking most lanes of traffic and stopping Brown and his friend from going any further. When Wilson went to open the driver's side door, he swung it open and it either hit Brown and rebounded off of him or Brown pushed it closed. According to the Department of Justice's report, Wilson and other witnesses stated that Brown then reached into the SUV through the open window, punching and grabbing Wilson, which is corroborated by bruising on Wilson's jaw and scratches on his neck, and Brown's DNA on Wilson's collar, shirt, and pants, and Wilson's DNA on Michael Brown's palm. There were other witnesses who stated that Wilson reached out of the SUV and grabbed Brown by the neck, but the state prosecutors did not credit their accounts because they were inconsistent with physical and forensic evidence. Wilson told investigators that he responded to Brown's reaching inside the SUV by withdrawing his gun because he could not access less lethal weapons while seated in the car. He alleged that Brown then grabbed the weapon and struggled with him to gain control of it. Wilson fired, shooting Brown in the hand. Autopsy results in bullet trajectory, skin from Brown's palm on the outside of the SUV door, as well as his DNA on the inside of the driver's door, do seem to corroborate Wilson's account that during the struggle, Brown used his right hand to grab and attempt to control Wilson's gun. Which is, all of this just...
Wow. I don't know. I'm having...
I know.
Like having a crisis live, like right now.
This is how I felt earlier. So According to 3 autopsies, Brown sustained a close-range gunshot wound to the fleshy portion of his right hand at the base of his right thumb. Soot from the muzzle of the gun was found embedded in the tissue of the wound, and that, coupled with the indicia of thermal change from the heat of the muzzle, indicate that Brown's hand was within inches of the muzzle of Wilson's gun when it was fired. A bullet recovered from the side panel of the driver's side door just above Wilson's lap also corroborates his account of the struggle for the gun and when the gun was fired. There was no video evidence, like I said, and no eyewitnesses to directly corroborate Wilson's account of Brown's attempt to gain control of the gun, though it does appear that the physical evidence supports that account, even though I was kind of disappointed to read that, to be honest with you. If I'm just being completely honest.
This is crazy.
It just, anyway, it just definitely.
This is not what I know about the case.
Yeah. But I mean, there's still, some little bits of up in the air information, but at the same time, there is physical evidence to support this, that it would be very difficult to fake this whole situation. It would just be very elaborate of a scheme for something that wasn't a planned attack to begin with or something. So after the initial shooting inside the SUV, the evidence establishes that Brown ran eastbound at least 180 feet away from the SUV, as there were bloodstains on the roadway, which DNA analysis confirmed was Brown's blood. And now is where it gets hairy, as there were witnesses stating 2 different versions of events. One, that Brown never moved back towards Wilson, and another stating that he did begin to move back toward Officer Wilson, appearing to pose a threat to him, wherein Wilson fired at him in self-defense until he fell to the ground. According to, because that's pretty serious. This is kind of like pivotal here, because it's one thing to be wrestling your gun away from him in your vehicle, but it's another to chase him down and be shooting him if he's running away from you.
Yes.
Which is what I had always been like, well, wait a second. So there's all that, but let's just wait and see what happens here. But let's continue on. According to autopsy reports, there were no entrance wounds in Brown's back, which would suggest that he wasn't shot while running away. But again, there is no direct evidence to prove this, and there was no physical evidence that could disprove Wilson's stated subjective belief that he feared for his own life. Ballistics analysis indicated that Wilson fired a total of 12 shots, 2 from the SUV inside of the vehicle, he sat inside the vehicle, and 10 on the roadway, which may seem excessive to some. According to autopsy results, Brown was shot by Wilson as few as 6 times and as many as 8 times. He fell to the ground dead as a result of a gunshot to the apex of his head. And aside from the shot to his hand from the inside of the SUV, all shots were fired at a distance greater than 2 feet. So there were no execution-style shots. Witness accounts and cell phone video prove that Wilson did not touch Brown's body after he fired the final shot and Brown fell to the ground. Although several witnesses stated that Brown had his hands up in an unambiguous sign of surrender prior to Wilson shooting him dead, some of those accounts are inaccurate because they are inconsistent with physical and forensic evidence, and some of those were inconsistent with statements that those witnesses had made immediately after the shooting took place. The witnesses the department found credible all gave varying accounts of how Brown was moving towards Wilson and what he was doing with his hands. They all established that he was moving toward Wilson when he was shot. Although a few witnesses did say that Brown held his hands up at shoulder level with his palms facing outward for a brief moment, those same witnesses described Brown then dropping his hands and, quote, charging at Wilson.
No.
Within 2 minutes of Wilson's initial encounter with Brown, Ferguson police officers responded to the scene of the shooting as they were already en route following his call for backup. Within minutes, residents were pouring onto the street. Within 20 minutes, the homicide investigation was handed over to the St. Louis County Police Department, who immediately began securing and processing the scene and conducting initial witness interviews. The crowd of onlookers grew and grew more hostile to the police, as witnessed in video footage of that afternoon, as some chanted, "Kill the police." There were reports of gunfire in the area at 1:55 p.m. and 2:11 p.m., which delayed the scene being processed fully and delayed the removal of Brown's body from the scene as they waited until it was safe to do so, which is another aspect of the situation that I had always heard, was that his body was left sitting out on the road for 4 hours, and it was, but According to them, it was in large part due to the safety of the personnel that needed to work the scene and process the scene. It still is like, it's disrespectful seeming, but it's also like, well, they had to process it correctly, and they didn't feel that they felt their safety was in jeopardy. So it does somewhat explain the circumstances of his body being left out for 4 hours on the road.
Sure. Yeah.
Investigators were on the scene for 5.5 hours, and throughout that time, they continued to seek additional assistance, describing the scene as volatile, causing concern for their safety and the integrity of the crime scene. Per the 3 autopsies, Brown was shot as little as 6 and as much as 8 times. Like I said, 2 entrance wounds may have been re-entry wounds, accounting for the discrepancy in the number of times that he was shot. They were saying that when he got shot in the hand, he might have been shot. It might have gone through his hand and into his shoulder, and then there was another shot, I think, to like his forehead that went through like his eye socket, and it might might have gone through to his shoulder, but they're not sure about that necessarily. It's just it's possible. So he was shot 6 to 8 times, and that's why there's a discrepancy there. The 2 most significant shots were the shot to the apex of his head, which would have immobilized him immediately, and the one to his right thumb, which corroborates with Wilson's account that Brown struggled for the gun in his SUV. The shot to his head entered the skull, the brain, and the base of the skull, coming to rest in the soft tissues of the right side of his face. Because Brown was taller than Wilson, he could not have been standing straight when he received the shot, and must have been bending over or falling forward when the shot was fired. It is also possible he was on his knees when the shot was fired, though that is not consistent with eyewitness accounts. It's more likely that he was coming towards Wilson and being shot, and he fell forward while Wilson continued to shoot, and the lack of stippling and soot that it was on Brown indicated that Wilson was at least 2 to 3 feet from Brown when the shot was fired. So it sounds to me like he might have been coming towards him, he was shooting him in defense, and then he began to fall, and he continued to shoot him. And we'll get into opinions about all this later, but right now this is just the facts of the situation per the evidence. In addition to those 2 shots, there was one to his central forehead that exited out of his right jaw, causing fractures to his facial bones. Another wound was to the upper right chest near the neck. There was another entrance wound to his lateral right chest that punctured the lower right lung, and a few more shots were to his right arm. There was no evidence to establish that Brown received any gunshot wounds to his back, nor any evidence that he was choked, strangled, or tightly grasped around the neck, as one witness had stated. He had some cuts that looked to be from glass, possibly when the police window was shattered from the gunshots. He also had abrasions on the right side of his face and forehead that pathologists opined were consistent with Brown impacting the ground upon death and sliding on the roadway due to the momentum from his quickly moving forward. All the evidence just fits with this, It's hard to say anything otherwise. DNA analysis found Brown's DNA on 4 significant locations: Wilson's gun, on the roadway further away from where he died, which suggested that he did come back from the furthest point which he had gone, on the SUV driver's side door and interior cabin area, which meaning that he had gotten himself at the window of the police car and had one hand on the outside and one hand on the inside of the door. And then the last was on Wilson's clothes, which he claimed he had been punched by Michael Brown while he was sitting in his car. A nurse practitioner who treated Wilson within 2 hours of the incident said he told her he was punched in the jaw, and she did note fresh pink scratch marks on the back of his neck, as well as swelling to his jaw. After the department concluded its 6-month investigation, they concluded that Darren Wilson's actions did not constitute prosecutable violations under the applicable federal criminal civil rights statute, which prohibits uses of deadly force that are, quote, objectively unreasonable, as defined by the U.S. Supreme Court. Accordingly, under the governing federal law and relevant standards set forth in the USAM, it is not appropriate to present this matter to a federal grand jury for indictment, and it should therefore be closed without prosecution, is what they concluded.
However, the Department of Justice did find in their investigation into the policing practices of the Ferguson Police Department that they had determined that the FPD had engaged in misconduct against the citizenry of Ferguson by, among other things, discriminating against the black community and applying racial stereotypes in a pattern or practice of unlawful conduct. The DOJ also found that Ferguson depended on fines and other charges generated by police, coming as a shock to absolutely nobody.
Yeah. A culture of fear persists in Ferguson even now, 5 years after Michael Brown's death. The city continues to try to put together the broken pieces, much like many other cities in America, full of income inequality, racial division, and police forces who feel that they are at war with black residents, and the residents that refuse to continue to allow the police brutality that affects people of color at an exponential rate. To continue, a new generation of activists has risen to the cause of fighting for the city's most vulnerable residents. A few statistics about the area. In 2019, 45 of the county's 60 homicides were black in a county where less than a quarter of the population is black, according to police statistics, and that's fairly staggering. That's about 3/4 of the homicides are black residents, and they're only a quarter of the population. That's fairly high. Activists say that in the years since the protests, they have been targeted in dangerous ways and continue to receive threats to this day. Reverend Darrell Gray found a suspicious box inside his car, so he called the police. The bomb squad arrived, and while they found no explosives, they did find a 6-foot python inside. Yeah.
Okay.
To be honest, I would be like, yahoo! Is that one of those beautiful emerald green ball pythons? I've been wanting one of those.
You just did such a Texan thing. Yee-hoo! Like, you did, like, the most Texan thing you could ever have done.
But I have been wanting one of those little ball pythons for a long time. But I'm just kidding, because if someone put a box with a python in my car, I would not be so thrilled.
No, that's frightening.
Yes. Cori Bush, a frequent leader of protests, says she's been vocal about the things she's experienced and continues to experience. She said her car has been run off the road, her home vandalized, and 6 years ago, someone shot a bullet into her car, narrowly missing her daughter, who was 13 at the time.
Yikes.
Ferguson's police force is currently being reformed under a federal consent decree, but activists say that the change is happening at a snail's pace.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
So during the George Floyd protests seen across the country in the summer of 2020.
Well, when was that? It feels like 25 fucking years ago.
I was going to say like 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's between 3 months and 20 years ago. There's no in between. Social media was inundated with posts encouraging people at the protests to keep other protesters' identities as anonymous as possible. A post saying, if you are participating in any kind of protests, do not share photos and videos of other protesters without blurring their faces and distinct features of their body. It has great potential to endanger their lives. Thinking of all of the incredible Ferguson activists who were killed mysteriously in the months and years following the protests, many of whom were popularly circulated photos and videos. There were 6 men that were connected to the protests in Ferguson that have died since 2014, and questions about their deaths have circulated within the community and among other activists ever since. 2 of the men were found dead inside of cars that were set on fire, and 2 died of apparent suicides, while 1 died by an accidental drowning and another died of a fentanyl overdose.
And the first time I heard about this was on Criminal, which is my favorite all-time podcast, I think. And I felt like, oh, if she's mentioning this, then there must be something to it.
Sure. The first time I heard about this was from you, and I was like, well, if she's mentioning this, then there's something to it. The first that we wanted to talk about was DeAndre Joshua. On November 25th of 2014 at 9 o'clock in the morning, just hours after the grand jury determined it was not going to bring charges against Darren Wilson for murder, DeAndre, who was 20 at the time, was found dead in a white Pontiac Grand Prix in the Canfield Green Apartments, the same location where Wilson shot Michael Brown. Shattered glass was covered in blood on the ground near the car. DeAndre's body was found in the driver's seat of the car, which was backed into a parking space. He had been shot once in the head, and his body was lit on fire, severely burning his arm, fingers, and legs. When police were investigating his death, his grandmother, Renita Towns, told USA Today, "Police don't care. He's black."
I mean, obviously something fucked up happened to him. He was murdered, you know?
100%. This is kind of like the Lavina Johnson case where the body was set on fire.
Okay.
Like, she tried to set herself on fire, quote unquote.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No.
I mean, somebody shot him in the head and then tried to destroy as much evidence as possible. Whoever
Lavina Johnson, Vanessa Guillen, her body was set on fire, and we know who did it, but it seems like a common practice for murderers, really.
Yeah.
There was also Sean Gray, who disappeared on Thanksgiving night of 2014. He was found dead almost a week later, drowned in the shallow basin of the River Des Peres. Sean lived about a block from the river, and when he was found, city police sent homicide detectives to investigate, and they considered his death suspicious.
Oh.
In February of 2015, the city medical examiner ruled his death as an accidental drowning with acute ethanol intoxication as a major contributing factor, although the exact amount of alcohol in his blood was not available. Sean's family...
what do they think? He just fell... Like, he just was so drunk that he was like, whoops!
Fell into a river.
And drowned it. I know it's drowned. But...
I know you know. Sean's family last saw him the morning of Thanksgiving when he was leaving his house to go to work at Cardwell's restaurant in Clayton, where he was a dishwasher. After he was found dead, his family found his 1997 Acura Integra outside Maggie Moo's Ice Cream and Treatery, about half a mile from Cardwell's. A Clayton police officer had stopped his vehicle on Thanksgiving. The police chief, Kevin Murphy, said he wasn't sure why the officer stopped him, but later learned that the officer did not arrest or ticket him, allowing him to take a taxi home because he may have been drunk.
Okay, so in that case, why did he end up in the river?
Right.
Was his being drunk, is that just kind of like a red herring, or did it just make him more vulnerable to someone, or did he just literally stumble into the river on his own accord?
Right.
You know? How often does that happen?
I don't know.
I know that there's a phenomenon of men in like I think the Philadelphia area drowning, being found in rivers, but it's nobody that I think that knows anything about it is like, this is just because they just get so drunk they stumble into the river. They're like, something weird is going on here.
Right.
And so that's kind of like this one too. It's like, maybe he stumbled in because he was drunk, but that also just sounds like a convenient way to tidy this all up. You know,
sure, yeah, of course.
I'm not saying it was, who knows what happened, but I'm not saying it was any particular any particular entity, but you know, it doesn't seem very often that a grown man is just going to stumble into the river.
Right. Kevin Murphy, the police chief, said that manpower and resources were particularly strained that week because of the grand jury's decision not to indict Darren Wilson. What's not clear, however, as Ashley just mentioned, is how he ended up in a river 6 days later.
Yeah. So he was missing for 6 days and then all of a sudden discovered. So did they say he would have been in the water that whole time? Did they know? I mean...
Concerning Sean Gray, there were rumors that he was killed after testifying in front of a grand jury in the Michael Brown case. But his family did dismiss those rumors, saying that he had no connection to the case whatsoever.
So it's a hinky situation, but probably unrelated to this particular situation.
Yes. Darren Seals is the third person that we're talking about, and about a year later, in September of 2016, Darren was 29 and suffered a similar death to DeAndre. His body was also found inside of a burning car after having been shot. Darren had become among St. Louis's most prominent anti-violence advocates, and a co-founder of Hands Up United, which was an activist collective formed after the shooting of Michael Brown. Unlike DeAndre and Sean, Darren was a prominent figure in the protests, and there's actually a video of him comforting Michael Brown's mother after the grand jury's decision.
Seals was very vocal about issues surrounding Brown's death and the St. Louis region, being featured in the Washington Post and on Al Jazeera. He was also an outspoken critic of the Black Lives Matter movement at times, accusing the group's leaders of hijacking Ferguson activism.
Initially, Darren ran with what is called a rough crowd in the articles, and when he was 18, he was charged with felony for slamming a cop on his head, in his own words. But in August of 2013, Darren, who was 26 at that time, had been shot 6 times while standing outside his cousin's house waiting for a ride. The first bullet tore through his stomach, 3 more hit his hands, which he had thrown up to block his face. As he fell to the ground, 2 more bullets struck his feet.
Yikes.
Maya Atten White, a St. Louis-based activist and a close friend of Darren's, said, every time he talked about getting shot, he would say that moment forever changed his life. In that moment, he made an agreement with himself to give his life to his community. He decided that once he got out of the hospital after the shooting, he would join the ranks of local anti-gun violence activists, according to accounts he gave in previous interviews and recollections of those who knew him. Not long later, he added police brutality to his list of causes. He was known as a, quote, Day One Ferguson protester, among the first to take to the street to demand justice after Michael Brown's death. According to Maya, who first met him on August 9th of 2014, she said, after Mike Brown, we saw it as our responsibility to step up. He gave his heart and soul to the movement, said Tony Rice, a mainstay at the Ferguson protests. He gave a lot of his money and time and energy. In the months preceding his murder, several friends and fellow activists said Seals had been laying plans for an economic boycott that he hoped would renew the conversation about police killings in St. Louis. Ebony Williams, a St. Louis area activist who was arrested protesting during the Ferguson demonstrations, said he fought alongside us all when everything went down. Yeah, he ranted and raved, and I agreed and disagreed on certain topics, but respect for him was high because he never cared about what people thought of the stuff he talked about. The best conversations of revolution came from him. He was deeply skeptical of national organizations that he felt had co-opted the organic energy and power of the Ferguson protests, and he was often accused of other activists of getting rich while Ferguson was left behind, which I'm sure was the case, as it usually is. Same thing happened kind of in Minneapolis. He publicly clashed with St. Louis natives like Templeton and Jeanette Elsie, who were prominent figures he insisted had sold out, and he harbored a special contempt for Jerome McKesson, a school administrator who traveled to Ferguson from his home in Minneapolis to join the protests, and eventually became among the nation's most prominent activists. Seals would often take to his social media accounts to level pointed attacks at McKesson and Black Lives Matter, like Ashley just talked about, which was founded after the death of Trayvon Martin, and the media quickly linked to the demonstrations in Ferguson. He said, millions and millions flowing through the hands of these organizations in the name of Mike Brown, yet we still don't see any of it coming into the Ferguson community or being used to help our youth. I've been calling all of this shit out for months, but most of the fake-ass movement motherfuckers are just as bad as the oppressors because y'all saw what was going on just as well as I did, and y'all sat back and did nothing. For other local activists who felt angered that the media attention had departed from Ferguson and Greater St. Louis, his social media posts were often touted as bold truth-telling. Despite this, many other organizers and activists distanced themselves publicly and privately from Seals, in part because his attacks on other activists felt too personal to be launched in public, and several said often included language or undertones that they found homophobic, misogynistic, or otherwise impolitic. The online tensions from his Facebook ended up reaching a breaking point physically in February of 2015, when during a protest outside of the Ferguson Police Department, he confronted McKesson in the parking lot of Andy Worm Tire and Wheel Auto Shop, where demonstrators often gathered. According to previous interviews with both men, Seals approached and accused McKesson of stealing money from local protests group, an accusation often leveled at him and other prominent activists, but it has never actually been substantiated. When McKesson smirked in response, he smacked him across the face.
Your face. Well, he has a temper, I guess.
Well, yeah, that's why I was like,
In the weeks before his death, he uploaded a live video of he and his younger brother's encounter with the Ferguson police, saying they drew guns on them. Later tweeting, yeah, 10 detectives pulled me and my 14-year-old brother over, pointed guns on us, and told me, choose your enemies wisely. Darren's Twitter profile described him as a businessman, revolutionary, activist, unapologetically black, African in America, fighter, leader. So St. Louis County Police spokesman Sergeant Sean McGuire told the Daily News that they, investigators, are aware that DeAndre Joshua died in the same kind of way. Anything's a possibility. Our detectives are always going to look into different avenues, or if it's the same kind of motive. And it definitely is, as I'm saying this, Ashley, it definitely is interestingly coincidental.
similar, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that they were both found in such similar ways. And they were both connected to this situation. Does that mean that there is a correlation? I am not sure.
Sergeant Benjamin Granada, a St. Louis County Police Department spokesman, said of his murder, there is no information that exists that would indicate they, meaning the protests and the murder, are related in any way.
I also do know, I do see the other side of the coin, I guess, that the police see the protesters as an enemy that doesn't support them. And so that's a huge problem that we have in this fight for civil rights is that the police see everybody that is fighting for racial equity and civil rights as kind of an enemy, you know, and we talked about that a little bit with the Alex Jones stuff, but that definitely creates a situation straight out of the gate where you're kind of in an us versus them mentality. Them. Exactly, and I don't know, you know, if that just means that you don't care to look into this stuff as much as you would if it were someone else, or if, you know, there's actual full-on conspiracy. You know, I don't really know about that, but I do see that it's kind of hard to be like, well, I'll just take your word for it 100% whenever you may see these people as being an opposition, you know?
Right, sure.
The next person we're going to talk about is 27-year-old Edward Crawford Jr. He was a father of 4 and became a symbol of resistance in the wake of the killing of Michael Brown and unrest in Ferguson. He emerged as a powerful voice for justice on the front lines of the Ferguson protests and was photographed by the St. Louis Dispatch, donned in an American flag shirt, throwing a flaming tear gas canister back at police. The photo immediately went viral and became part of the St. Louis Dispatch's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the protests. And that's where I actually heard about this entire activist death situation, because the podcast Criminal covered Crawford years ago whenever he got in trouble legally for throwing this canister back at police, which it's also like, but you threw it at me. You threw it at me and that's okay. But
his thing was also that he had said that it was kind of instinctual and he was trying to protect all of the other people who were protesting. Yeah. I had read an interview that he had done where he said that he was trying to protect the children that were also there at the protests. Yeah, yeah. So what would you do in that situation? Right. If you were having a gas canister thrown at you? I mean, that's amazing. Those are amazing instincts, if we're being 100% honest, because I would just duck and cover.
Yes. It definitely, I mean, to me, I'm just like, well, what do you expect? You're throwing tear gas canisters into crowds of people. What do you expect? Sure. That they're not going to throw them back at you? And should we not be allowed to either? I don't know. I mean, but we all know I'm, controversial in my opinions of this kind of thing. Anyway.
As far as his death is concerned, according to a police summary, Edward was in the back seat of a car with 2 women who were also in the car with him. As the car was driving through the Hyde Park neighborhood, the gun went off. The woman with Crawford recounted how he said he was distraught over what he described as personal matters. They then heard him looking for something in the back seat, where he then proceeded to shoot himself in the head. His father, Edward Sr., believes that the shooting was not intentional, but it was accidental, saying, "I don't believe it was a suicide." Also adding that he had seen his son 2 days prior to the shooting and was in good spirits, having recently found a new apartment and training for a new job, also leaving 4 children behind, like Ashley just said.
Yeah. Ugh, what a terrible accident if that was an accident.
If it was an accident, sure.
It would definitely be weird slightly to do it in the backseat of a friend's vehicle.
With 2 other people, yeah. Yeah.
If it wasn't accidental, but the whole thing, that's definitely strange. But obviously they found the gun back there, so it wasn't like it was just a bullet that came through the car.
Right.
There was a gun there. The next person that we're going to discuss is Danye Jones. In October of 2018, 24-year-old Danye Jones was found hanging from a tree in his backyard in North St. Louis County. His mother, Melissa McKinney, an activist in Ferguson, posted on Facebook after her son's death, "They lynched my baby."
So the medical examiner's report said that Danye lived at the home of his mother, Melissa McKinney's. He was last seen alive by his mother at about 9 p.m. on October 16th as he walked into her backyard carrying a backpack. The report said McKinney's did not find this unusual. That night, investigation later discovered he had texted his sister Mamisha, "I'm sorry," at 9:30 p.m., and she had replied saying, "I love you." At about 6 o'clock in the morning, his stepfather, Derek Chapman, returned home from work and noticed a light on in Danye's basement bedroom. Melissa was waking up and they realized that neither of them knew where Danye was. Melissa remarked that she often told her kids to turn off the lights. Not shocking, my mom did the same. Mm-hmm. And Derek noticed the backpack on the rear patio. The McKinneys looked outside and that's where they saw him hanging from the tree by a bed sheet. He was only 24. Melissa was an active Ferguson demonstrator and said in a TV interview that she did think that there was foul play involved. Before lowering Danye to the ground, Derek took a photo of him because his pants were around his ankles and he found that to be strange. When the medical examiner's investigator arrived, he noted that there was a wooden chair knocked on its side under the tree where Jones had been hanging. The report said Danye's family indicated that he had several times over the years mentioned that he felt depressed, although he had never been clinically diagnosed with depression. They noted that he had a lot weighing on his mind. He had recently been unsuccessful trying to start a real estate company, and he was dealing with rumors of him being gay. He did not leave a suicide letter. An examination by an assistant medical examiner found no scratches, contusions, or any other marks. He had some cannabis, but no alcohol in his system, and an autopsy was not conducted. Despite this, Melissa insisted that he was upbeat, not suicidal, and did not know how to tie the types of knots used in the ligature. She said that the sheet that was used did not match the family's sheets, and he had packed an overnight bag, which had been left on the patio, which she said was a suggestion that he trusted and had planned to leave the house with the person who did kill him.
She also says that he had bruises on his face, blood spatter on his shirt, and both she and the police say that there was that chair there. She also said that in the months leading up to her son's death, there were 7 separate instances where cars with tinted windows would sit in front of their house and would drive off when they were approached. And another time that 6 police officers stood outside their home staring into the window for no discernible reason. Again, as we do with in cases like this where the family is incredulous that this could ever have happened, if their child did in fact commit suicide, it does seem like that's fairly common, that family just does not see it coming or they don't expect it. I think that, it's possible that that overnight bag had the stuff that he needed perhaps to do this with it, the sheets that he needed to commit this suicide. Now, it's possible that that's not true at all and he didn't commit suicide, but we just really have no idea whatsoever. I guess it would have been good if an autopsy could have been done in that circumstance, but I don't know why they didn't perform one. But again, there's not a lot to suggest that it went anyway. We have no idea why that happened. If he committed suicide or if someone murdered him,
right?
It's not clear, and there's no investigation going forward to figure out if that was the case, or was not the case. In 2019, 31-year-old Palestinian-American activist Bassem Masri, who frequently live-streamed video of Ferguson demonstrations, was found unresponsive on a bus and could not be revived. Toxicology results revealed he died from a heart attack following an overdose on fentanyl. Which, sure, looking at the CDC data from 2016, fentanyl overdoses were on the rise. Oh, yeah. But it is also a coincidence that is difficult to simply overlook in a situation with other awful coincidences. As I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here, but it is an awfully interesting circumstance that and I'll get into a little bit more, but he was an outspoken activist questioning a lot of things that were going on, and then he's found dead in a bus mysteriously. Right. But it's also possible that he overdosed. Masri was an effective community activist. With just a cursory glance at his Twitter account, you can see that he was very active in his community, trying to help bring awareness for any issues that were affecting the city and its people. And a tweet I came across regarding Darren Seals, who we talked about a little while ago, who was found dead, from September 7th, 2016, a Twitter user named Sarah Kinzier tweeted theories about Darren Seals' death, and Masri responded with this: Darren Seals was a leader of our movement in Ferguson, and he was clearly assassinated. He spoke nothing but truth, which I just thought was an interesting coincidence, considering 2.5 years later, he's found dead also. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it could mean something. Right. Or not. I just keep going.
I mean, it could, but maybe not. But also, perhaps
it's awful coincidence,
Yeah.
If it is. You can find tributes to Masri all over the internet, from journalists who covered the protest to fellow activists, all in agreement that he was a fierce ally and fighter for the movement for racial equality. He told an interviewer in 2014 that he did this because he believed the mainstream media ain't going to say the truth about Brown's death. They ain't going to never say the truth. They got their own narrative.
I mean, we have seen a rise in people documenting protests, current protests. I mean, at least in 2020, that was like the main crux of 2020, is that everything was documented on cell phones. And it's available for everybody to pull out their cell phone and say,
and the interactions with police as well. It's like that's holding the police more accountable, though it's not 100% obviously, but it is definitely holding police more accountable. Yeah, if there had been someone filming the altercation between Michael Brown and Darren Wilson to begin with, there would be a lot less questions and the whole circumstance about what had actually happened, because that's what the problem is.
Right.
You leave anything up to a little bit of question, and then everybody's gonna run with that, because it's not certain.
Yes.
So on Twitter, Miss Pack Yeti wrote regarding Masri's death, there are some folks who you wonder if they're all the way in for liberation. You could never wonder that of Bassem Masri. His investment was real and his commitment was unwavering. I don't even understand why we keep losing activist families so young. Which is a good question, but I think that's a very layered answer. If those suicides were legitimate suicides, it speaks volumes of the tremendous psychological and emotional toll that the modern civil rights movement has taken on its young members. Emotionally, it is a struggle to know the reality of the conditions of the community that you are fighting for, knowing the limitations of the reforms you're asking for, and how far off true justice actually is, said Kayla Reed, an organizer with the St. Louis Action Council. I think mentally, emotionally, sometimes the same thing that wears you down is the same thing that you have to find motivation in. It's a complicated space to occupy for a long period of time. And that is something that I really don't think that many non-people of color even think about or even consider, is the burden of living in a society that has taken from you and taken from you and taken from you and continues to treat you as less than, while also appropriating your culture, that culture that has survived throughout all the effort to strip it away from you. People have, it's like such a complicated situation. People of color are constantly fighting against the tide of prevailing racism, discrimination, and a large portion of the population that refuses to even accept, understand that it's even happening, and definitely aren't ready to evolve to fight for equity for everyone. So it's when you're talking about race and the fight for racial equity, it's like you don't even think about the toll that it takes on people. And I know I'm just repeating what I just said, but you just don't think about the toll that it takes on people of color. And that's why everyone, yes, every single day. And when you're not in that position, it's very easy to be like, I'm exhausted, so I'm gonna just not think about that today. Whereas if you're a person of color, you don't have that option. And that's something I would talk to my friend Nicole about. Is just she's like, and I think we've talked about it. You and I have talked about it on the show before, but it's like you don't even think about how that creates that trope of like the angry black woman or whatever. It's yes, because I'm having to fight my way through shit every single day. And it affects me deeply every single day. And I can't say, wait a second, I'm exhausted and I'm so depressed right now, I can't even think about it, because you have to keep fighting. So you got to think about that toll that it takes on everybody, and then the toll that it takes on the activists who are just sitting here just trying to fight in the face of such opposition.
Yeah. I can only imagine how completely exhausting that is every fucking day, and nobody's listening. And that's the issue, is nobody's fucking listening. Or at least that's what my perception is that
some people are listening, but not enough people are listening, for sure, as we've seen.
Right.
I do think that, that's why it's important to ask your friends of color, family that are people, anybody in your life that are people of color, how they're doing anytime. But also be open to, like, I'm an ally, period. But I'm not trying to overstep my bounds. I always obviously have more to learn about all of this and where people of color are coming from. So don't get me wrong. If you're listening, I'm not trying to act like I'm anything here. I just know that this is tough. So even if there is no connection between the protests and the activist's death, some can't help but wonder if the investigations are thorough, like I was saying. These protesters and their deaths may not be a high priority for police since there is this antagonistic relationship, Washington University sociologist Otis Johnson said. I think there is a need for them to have a greater sense of urgency. And while it's not entirely clear if residual trauma and stress from the protests and harassment aftermath contributed to the possible suicides, Johnson said that many activists do feel a sense of hopelessness.
Totally understandable.
Black St. Louis County residents are 3 times more likely to be poor than white residents, which often means that they don't have adequate health insurance that could not only allow them to address physical ailments, but mental health issues as well.
Absolutely. I was reading something about mental health for specifically women of color, that Black women are some astronomical percentage more likely to commit suicide or not be diagnosed with with health issue, which is fucking nuts to me. I don't understand how. I mean, I guess I don't understand how.
I guess it's like it's the socioeconomic circumstances that they have been like forced into, but also there is racism within the medical community where Black people, especially Black women, their issues are disregarded by the medical community, which is definitely a thing that there's just so many things to tackle here, but that's huge.
That's another thing that I had heard, that it was a quote that said, doctors are to women of color what police are to men of color. Yeah. Which I was like, that astounded me.
It's the same thing with COVID, for example. People of color, minorities are at greater risk of dying from COVID, of being hospitalized from COVID, because there's not adequate health services available to them. So, this is something that obviously affects the entire country in various ways, but we're just talking about this specific situation today. So there's a recent documentary that was released called What Killed Michael Brown by conservative Black scholar, which I use that term loosely, Shelby Steele, who rejects the way mainstream culture in the U.S. views race politics. He says that white guilt and enormously seductive post-1960s liberalism, not racism, are responsible for the death of Michael Brown. Steele, a senior professor at Stanford University's right-wing Hoover Institute, has long been a thorn in the side of progressives and most Black Americans with his, quite frankly, shitty views on race relations, multiculturalism, and affirmative action. Steele and his son Eli said they wanted to figure out why Americans responded to Ferguson, which is what drove the focus of their documentary. They asked the question, is Michael Brown in any way responsible for his own death? While I do now feel like he is partly responsible for his own death, I still do not believe that a police officer has the right to shoot you dead in the street, even if you're breaking the law. But it is definitely more complicated when you're trying to defend yourself and your life. So, as I will get into in a little while. So the
contrarian in me wants to like ask, well, I mean, I get that he was reaching for his gun, but like the contrarian in me is like, well, then why didn't he just tase him?
Oh, because he couldn't reach his taser from that seated position, is what he said.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. Well, okay, that's fine.
So the documentary was not approved for release on Amazon initially, to which Amazon told the Steeles in an email that their film, quote, doesn't meet Prime Video's content quality expectations and will not be accepting resubmissions of this title, and the decision may not be appealed. They claim that Amazon let themselves be captured by white guilt and doesn't actually want justice. They want the look of racial innocence attached to their brand. Well, and actually, that decision was reversed, and it was now actually put on Amazon, and it's absolute shit quality, which is probably the reason why it was rejected to begin with, because there's plenty of right-wing propaganda on Amazon for you to view at the ready, sure. So I don't think that's the reason.
We actually just watched one yesterday accidentally. We didn't realize that that's what it was going to be, to be honest with you. It was Encounters of the Fifth Kind, the documentary. Yeah. Just wanted to know about aliens. Just wanted to watch aliens. Yeah. Literally, that's it. Turned out to be exactly what you're talking about. So accidental. Lame. Anyways.
In the film, Shelby Steele stands in front of the apartment complex a few feet from where Michael Brown was killed and left laying in the street, while a narrator says, groups pass on their identity to their young by telling them cautionary tales. Watch out for the whites. So if you're Black and you step outside of any of these apartments and you see Michael Brown's body, at that moment, before any evidence or witness testimony, all you can see is a victim of American racism. And I will say, there are certain aspects that I'm like, okay, I don't necessarily disagree with you on that, but you are coming from a place of nonsense, okay? So one scholar, Dr. Don Wargs, pointed out that this is quite a questionable approach to the situation. He says, Dr. Steele makes a long-standing argument that Blacks are complicit in their own suffering. He is a political science professor and program director for the African and African American Studies program at Towson University in Maryland. He continues, it's troubling to see people discount Black people's personal lived experience. Any journalist worth his salt could go into a Black neighborhood in Ferguson, for example, and talk to the people, and no doubt they'd all present different perspectives on how racism has touched them. And you know who else used to espouse similar opinions is that self-righteous rapist himself, Bill Cosby. Not that there's really any correlation there, but I do remember thinking, like, why does Bill have to be like this? And then it's because he's a piece of shit.
And now we know why. Yeah.
Anyway, so the flip side of this is that while many white folks are unaware of white privilege and systematic racism, it is still very present today, in case you've been living under a rock. It's fucking real, and you don't have to be in denial about it, because it's in our face, you know?
Right. Well, not only racism, but colorism as well. For instance, you've called me a person of color because I'm Latina, but I 100% benefit from looking white.
Yeah.
I'm so white. People, when I start speaking in Spanish, people are like, oh, because I don't look like I speak Spanish.
Yeah.
You know, I don't look like that was my first language.
Right.
I don't look like that, though. I don't look like my family. Like, I kind of fear for my grandparents who live in Oklahoma because they speak nothing but Spanish with one another.
Yeah.
And they're my family. I never realized, I mean, I guess I was always under the assumption that, white privilege isn't a thing for me.
Yeah.
You know, because I'm not white.
Yeah.
I'm Latin.
Yeah.
But hella white passing.
Right. Yeah. So if you want, you can look up The Invisible Knapsack, a theory by feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh, associate director of the Wellesley Collage. College Center for Research on Women. Her paper, White Privilege and Male Privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies in 1988, was very eye-opening for me when I first saw it when I was like, I don't know, 20 years old. And I kind of forgot about it for a while, but it's very relevant. So she begins by stating the following. I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. And that in her work in women's studies, she had often noticed the unwillingness of men to admit that they are overprivileged, even if they may admit that women are disadvantaged, which go hand in hand. Realizing that hierarchies in society are interlocking and that there was most likely a similar phenomenon of white privilege that was similarly denied and protected, she began to kind of think about this in a more intellectual way. She realized that she had been taught about racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but hadn't been taught one of its corollary aspects, that white privilege must put whites at an advantage. There are things that many whites will simply not even think about that put them in a position of advantage. Just to name a few, she wrote, and think about this for yourself, for that matter. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. Pretty simple. Another one is, I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. Another, when I am told about our national heritage or about quote-unquote civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. Another, I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race, which is starting to slowly happen, but it's nowhere near the point where it needs to be. Another is, I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. Yeah. And the last one that I will go, there are a lot of them, and they're all very pertinent, but I picked some of the ones that stood out to me. And so the last one is, I'm never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group, which Black people are asked to do that a lot. But I remember first reading about this knapsack and thinking, I never thought about the fact that I go, just about anywhere I go, I'm the majority. Like, everybody looks like I do, generally speaking. And if if I am going into a situation where I'm the minority, what am I? Sounds like I'm trying to say menorah. Where I'm the minority, I might be a little uncomfortable with that, because I'm not used to that. But that's something that people of color have to be used to all the fucking time. Unless you're living unless you're just like segregated, you're going to be put in situations where you are forced to be around people that are kind of shitty, probably racist, sometimes.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because, and then that I just said I'm white passing, but like being Latina, I grew up, maybe not obviously, but I grew up in California where there's a heavy Latin community. And I'm like, oh, mi gente, like, I know you. Yeah. Like we have the same culture. Like, we're loud and boisterous and all the things. But then moving to Minnesota, I was like, everybody here is white.
It is the whitest.
Except where I live is
true.
Thankfully the one part of Minnesota where there's like a lot of Latin community.
Yeah.
So like that's nice, but it's funny that you say that because that was actually the most jarring thing about me moving here.
Oh yeah.
Is that everybody really is white, and then if I see somebody that's Latin at my bank, I will immediately switch over to Spanish and like just talk to them in Spanish and like, what are you doing here? And they ask me what I'm doing here. But anyways, that was just that's like my little take on it. Yeah. Where I'm like, yeah, that is kind of true. Like feeling like you are the minority, even though again, I pass as not being the minority.
Yeah, but still, it seems to me that obliviousness about white advantage, like obliviousness about male advantage, is kept strongly encultured in the United States so as to maintain the myth of meritocracy, the myth that democratic choice is equally available to all. keeping most people unaware that freedom of confident actions is there for just a small number of people, props up those in power, and serves to keep power in the hands of the same group that have most of the power already.
I was going to say about that the myth that democratic choice is equally available to all. I mean, we kind of just saw this with the election. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you were paying attention to it, but there were so many things that were done in order to keep communities of color from voting. Yeah. And even now, we have a lot of things that are happening with specifically communities of color.
Yeah, trying to disenfranchise their vote.
The current administration is trying to exactly disenfranchise communities of color, and they're trying to take the votes of 7 million people and say no, they don't count because the counties in which they voted are corrupt. Yeah. And the counties in which they voted are mostly communities of color. For instance, Detroit. Yeah. I think Detroit is now suing the current administration and saying, you're trying to disenfranchise us. The fucking gerrymandering that happens, like everything that's going on. I feel like maybe that's why I'm in the emotional state that I am recently, because I've noticed that there is.
Oh, you're having your first awakening.
I feel like maybe not even my first. I think maybe my second this year. You know, like, and it's only this year where I'm like, it's really
no. I mean, like, I think that you are now realizing these things are going on in the world.
Oh yeah,
like, in general, and so that is taking a toll. That's taking a toll as it does.
Right. Sure.
I mean, because like becoming more aware. Being more aware is and enlightened is definitely not just a gift, because it takes a toll.
Yeah,
for sure. Like gerrymandering, that's been going on for so long, and that's the only reason why half the people get votes for in general. Period.
Right.
Get elected in general. I mean, there's a really good documentary about it. If you want, well, we could talk about it another time. Back to Shelby Steele, the guy of that documentary, who was saying it's liberalism and white guilt that killed Michael Brown. He says that since the 60s, whites have lived under the accusation that they're racist, thus they feel compelled to prove that they are not. This compulsion is white guilt, which is not actual guilt at all. Warg calls this a case of bad policing, and the U.S. Department of Justice agrees about that. Black Lives Matter is so effective because it's calling attention to the systematic dehumanization of black people and critical of police violence. Steele says the liberalism that insists on Michael Brown being a victim of racism also makes him an invisible man. We have no chance to know what really ailed him when he arrived at that profoundly bad decision to slam his fist into the officer's face, wrestle him for his gun, and make that final fateful charge at Officer Wilson. I don't believe racism drove Darren Wilson to shoot Michael Brown. I think the motive was so simple as to be unbelievable. He feared for his life. Steele is attempting to suggest that racism and oppression are not the biggest issues facing Black Americans today, and instead the culprit is liberalism, affirmative action in particular. It's an interesting theory, but what about the simple truth that minorities have been driven to lower paying jobs and segregated communities, are more likely to die from, like I said, from COVID than non-Hispanic white Americans? There's a whole slew of things that are right in your face. That said, in this particular situation, there is definitely a disconnect between the liberal idea of what happened and the conservative ideal of what happened. We shouldn't be forcing any non-truth on the situation at all on either end of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's inappropriate to force a narrative on either on the situation, because at the end of the day, it is all like a narrative. I've noticed.
Right. Yes.
There are certain narratives that one side tries to push and the other side tries to push. Why don't we just look at all of the fucking facts?
Yeah. So, from all the facts presented, it does seem that Michael Brown made a series of bad decisions that resulted in his death. Were the initial circumstances of Officer Wilson's confrontation with Brown and his friend enough to warrant the use of a gun? Absolutely not. If, in fact, Michael Brown did attempt to gain hold of the gun while Wilson was in his vehicle, you do have to ask yourself, what are the circumstances in which an officer is warranted in drawing and further firing their weapon? If you've been listening long enough, you know I am by no means a cop apologist or even a fan, to be honest. There is a systematic racism ingrained in our laws and in the way that our law enforcement is trained and how they conduct themselves. It is indisputable, and the evidence is right in all of our faces and has been for well over 100 years. But when they are in situations where their lives are put in immediate danger, shouldn't they be allowed to defend themselves? How many shots are acceptable to ensure that you are not killed yourself? You know, that's a argument that I used to get into sometimes with my ex, because he worked for the fire department, and so he worked closely with police a lot of the time. And you know, I've always been fairly critical of police, and he isn't like a bootlicker or anything, but he definitely understood where they were coming from sometimes more than I would like to even put myself in those shoes. And so there were times where I'd be like, he shot that man 15 times, or, you know, he shot him 10 times. Like, how many times do you have to shoot somebody? And he was like, Ashley, if you think you're about to be killed yourself, how many shots are too many shots to make sure that you have your life whenever this is done with? Like, you can't say, I took 3 shots, that's all I can take, and then he's still coming at you because you shot him in the arm and the cheek. You know, it's just, it's such a difficult situation. This incident was the catalyst for the Black Lives Movement to become nationally recognized, and it was also the catalyst for what appears to be the modern civil rights era, and it was long fucking overdue. It really was. This movement needed the momentum that it got from this situation. Unfortunately, it does appear like the wrong martyr was chosen. It doesn't seem to me like Michael Brown he wasn't just an innocent party in this circumstance. There could have been racism that made Officer Wilson pull over and speak to him to begin with, for sure, you know, and according to the DOJ investigation, it seems like it probably was the case that, yes, that they were operating under some fairly strong racist premises and whatnot on a regular basis. But then what happened after that, as the facts and the physical evidence present themselves, I don't know.
No, I don't know how I would articulate it, because again, as you were going through this, I was like, oh, yeah. And I was like going through a crisis where I was like, oh, this is not what I know to be the case.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you would articulate it either, Ashley.
Well, I mean, not that it matters now. It is what it is, and the fight for racial equity needs to be fought, and it needs to become a battle that we all take part in, not just some of us. And it doesn't really matter now that this movement was kind of spearheaded under false pretenses, because it's a real issue, and since then we have seen this happen time and time again. So although I went into researching this episode with an honestly 100% different idea of what it was going to be about and what I knew as fact, I do think it's important that we discuss the truth as far as the physical facts present themselves, as the fight for racial equity is not going to be won without exposing the truth, discussing the facts, and making changes in reality. Otherwise, we are no better than the people that we criticized last episode who
absolutely
fabricate information to fit in a narrative that they want to push. We need to be aware that this is a problem. It's a prevalent problem, and we have plenty of factual and circumstances to use as evidence that this is going on. Now, it is a fucking shame, period, that someone had to die, that Michael Brown had to die in this circumstance over some fucking nonsense. Like, you know, when I was like, why did the shop person even call 911 on a couple of fucking blunt wrappers that you picked up off the front thing? I can't totally say that, because I mean, he still was stealing from what is your livelihood, but it's just like one of those circumstances where it's like, let's choose appropriate action stop calling police on Black people for stuff that is inconsequential, because we'd see what happens. Things get escalated quite quickly. But I also do see that you can't use Michael Brown and George Floyd in the same circumstance as evidence of police brutality, because we saw what happened from George Floyd from the get-go, in that when he got pulled over, we saw the whole thing play out, and that was not okay, period. You know?
Again, it has a lot to do with the fact that we use cell phones now to document our lives. I mean, honestly, thank goodness that we can have this device in our hands to record and say, okay, this is what's going on right now. I need to start recording this in the event that facts do get skewed, because the thing with Michael Brown's case as well is that there are so many speculative things up in the air still too. Yeah. With George Floyd, that's less the case.
We saw it from the moment he got pulled over and said, please don't pull that gun on me. I'm so scared. Right. And then we saw the cop kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes. So, right. But what I kind of took away from all of this, because honestly, I was very distraught. Like, there was part of me that was like, I don't even want to do this episode anymore. But I think, like I said, I think it's important to present facts. I also do think that, like I said, no matter what, this did spur on a movement that needs to be in place. And I definitely kind of feel like organically this kind of happened, that we're now going, we talked about the civil rights movement, and now we are beginning the modern civil rights movement, and we couldn't cover any of the cases where police brutality has been unwarranted 100% without beginning with this story and the truth of what happened. And obviously, like we've said, there are aspects that are still unclear, and I still am like, why would he have run back at him? You know, like, that doesn't even seem believable. But there's that blood evidence that shows that he went further and then he retraced steps. So he must have been coming back, and he was falling forward, and that fits very much with him coming at the police officer and him shooting him while he came at him. You know, so there are aspects that are definitely like, okay, and then there are others where I'm just like, but why? You know, why did that happen like that? And it seems like we'll never know. So it's unfortunate. It's obviously tragic and unfortunate, but it did create something good did come of it, as crappy as that may be to say. It's something that needed to happen. It was something that needed to happen, and it happened because of this. I do want to end with the quote from Dr. Don Wargs, the political science professor and program director at the Towson University of Maryland in the African American Studies program, that whether Brown committed a crime or not, he did not deserve to die. It is not enough just to not kill innocent people. The police should not be killing guilty people either, as that is a goddamn part of our justice system, that we are afforded the being innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely. 100%. Okay. I totally agree. And also something that happened, I believe, in the summer going into fall, was the murder of Jacob Blake. Jacob Blake was found to have had a knife in his car, and he was found to have assaulted women. Mm-hmm. I think that came out as being factual. However, just because he was a bad person does not mean that just because he made bad decisions doesn't mean that it was warranted that he was killed.
Right.
Everybody in this country should be awarded. It is said that they were awarded the right to a fair trial. Mm-hmm. And that should be the case for everybody.
Obviously, that's not the case for everybody, because many people don't get that opportunity. But
exactly, but it should be the case for everybody. Mm-hmm. And that regardless of what kind of a person you were, you deserve that. You deserve that. Yeah. That is the bare minimum that you deserve. Mm-hmm. So he's right. The police should not be killing guilty people either.
Again, really, though, yeah, it's just such a gray area here.
Yes. Okay. But who are they to judge who is guilty, and who are they to be the moral compass?
They're absolutely not. They absolutely are not at all. It's just in this situation, is it a matter of defending yourself from death as well. You know, that's the only thing
Right.
that really does stick. Is kind of like a sticking point for me, and it hurts
Sure.
to say, to be honest. But
Sure.
I'm saying it because I'm like, well, I mean, are we supposed to be? Are police supposed to just be out there as martyrs? You know, to be murdered because they can't defend themselves if someone is in fact threatening their lives? You know, it's hard. It's a hard. It's not.
It's a hard
easy.
pill to swallow.
Yeah.
It is a hard pill to swallow for
Yeah.
sure.
So, okay. But thank you for listening, everyone. We appreciate it. Yeah. Okay.
If you would like to join our Patreon, we put out an episode a week if we're not mentally ill.
I'm mentally and physically dying.
We do. It's just like a banter. It's like our banter creeping up show. And we do special like things for our patrons as well, like merch and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So if you'd like to join, head on over to patreon.com/creepitrealpod. If you would like to support us in another way, non-monetarily, that's better.
It's great. It's not better. It's just as good.
It's amazing. Head on over to iTunes.com and leave us a review. If not, feel free to follow us on Spotify. That's been a huge algorithm booster too, I guess. Follow us on YouTube and, you know, like all of our videos.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Just head over to creepitrealpod.com if you want to get all the links for all those things. We love you. Have a great life.
Have a great everything.
Creep it real.